Hi, my name is Samuel Loncar. I'm a philosopher and historian of science and religion, and I specialize in the intersection of the concepts and history of philosophy, religion, and science. And this is a public lecture series on the most important book written in the 20th century in the history and philosophy of science, the book by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. This is the most cited academic book by many counts of the 20th century. It is an extraordinarily significant book that not only changed the field that it was written in, but in some ways created a new field. And so I think that Kuhn's work, because it is the source of so many famous ideas, if you've heard the idea of a paradigm shift, for example, that comes from Kuhn's book. He talks about the concept of a paradigm very influentially, and that's become part of the broader culture. So Kuhn's book is one of the most influential books in a very important area, the way we think about science. But it's also been an extremely influential book in the academy more broadly, in scholarship more broadly, and even in, as I said, in popular culture, where many of us are familiar with the word paradigm shift, the concept of this, even if we've never heard of Thomas Kuhn or this book. So because of my work in the history and philosophy of science and religion, I'm very interested in helping the public come to a better understanding of the extraordinary riches of philosophy and science and how they're connected to each other and to the history of human search for meaning, or what we might call spirituality. So this is going to be a course that's going to introduce the structure of scientific revolutions in 15 roughly half hours, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, text seminar lectures. The text seminar is a sort of format that they still have in a German university where you do a very detailed reading of a text. And because this book is so important, and happily it's so well written and so concise, I'm going to do a lecture on each chapter. There's 13 major chapters, so I'll have an introductory lecture today and a concluding lecture, so a total of 15 lectures. And because this book is so interesting, I think it more than merits that time and attention. So let me start by telling you in this lecture today, as an introduction, what the structure of scientific revolutions is about and why it is so important, and therefore why you might want to take this free course. You can listen to it, watch it for free, and you can learn more about my work, on any of the videos. You can check out my work and look at courses I've done. I'll bring up my work when it matters in the course of this series. Now, this book, as I said, is already important because we know it's one of the most, if not the most cited academic book of the 20th century. It's the most important single book in the field of the history and philosophy of science. And it's simply one of the most important books in the history of 20th century scholarship since it was originally published. And the first edition of this book came out in 1962 by the University of Chicago Press. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Thomas Kuhn, but not a lot biographically in this introductory lecture. What I want to explain rather, as I mentioned, is why this book has become so important beyond just its academic influence. Why has the academic influence been as significant? And what is the deeper significance? What's the intrinsic, you could say, merit of the structure of scientific revolutions? And the answer to that question, I think quite simply, is Thomas Kuhn probably himself did not realize this. But when he wrote this book, he created a new field. And I don't think that field has fully come into existence yet because the field is paradoxical. And it's paradoxical because it's self-conscious. So I think Thomas Kuhn actually created a type of scientific revolution by describing scientific revolutions. And the fact that this book created a revolutionary impact is extraordinarily significant. The book is about how scientific revolutions, and that concept is crucial, of course, as we'll see, radical changes in outlook in science, how they happen and why they happen. And what Kuhn is really interested in is what is science and how does it actually work? So that's what Kuhn's interested in. He's interested in the actual logic of how science develops, how it progresses, how it accumulates knowledge. And Kuhn was a distinguished physicist. He had a background in Ph.D. in nuclear physics at, I believe, Harvard. And then he got a fellowship at the extremely elite and distinguished Harvard Society of Fellows, where they basically just pay you for 3 years to do whatever you want, have lunch once or twice a week, I think, or lunch and dinner, and that's, I think, your only obligation academically. So it's it's one of the most, if not the most, probably elite postdoc in American academia. And, many of the people who've got it quite understandably come from Harvard, because Harvard knows who their good students are. And so Kuhn got this 3-year fellowship, and it led to a change in his life, which he writes about in the preface to the book. And it's quite significant, because you could say, well, why, if someone was doing nuclear physics, would they become interested in the history of science? Which is a very good question. If you're a scientist, you might wonder, did Kuhn abandon his true calling as a scientist? And I think the answer is no. Kuhn deepened his understanding of science in a way that led him to change the way all of us think and understand science. So Kuhn was always interested in science. He was a practicing natural scientist of a very, advanced form of science, physics, which is obviously very mathematically demanding, and nuclear physics, which is a very exciting field, particularly, in the time that Kuhn is working at it. It's within, roughly a decade and a half of the Manhattan Project. So Kuhn was capable of having a very just good career in the natural sciences, but his curiosity led him to become the most famous historian of science of the 20th century. So science itself was really Thomas Kuhn's obsession. Science itself and the nature of science is really the obsession of Thomas Kuhn's entire life. And I would suggest, if you're not familiar with them, that people who become historians of science are as interested in science as people we call scientists. I mean, they are scientists in the sense of scholars. And often I think they have an even broader interest, and they want to understand, what is science? Like, how does it work? Not just what is one tiny piece of it, which, if you're contributing to science in a particular natural scientific field, generally, unless you're working in an interdisciplinary way, you're just going to work on a tiny bit of a puzzle, as we'll see. Whereas if you're a historian of science, you are capable of looking at longer time periods and looking at broader and, in some ways, different deep questions, like, why do scientific theories change? So this question about science and what is science led Kuhn to study the history of science. And Kuhn studying the history of science led to this book. So this book was the product of Kuhn's transition from being a nuclear physicist into becoming a historian, particularly initially of physics and the exact sciences, the physical sciences. And he then taught for a number of years at Harvard with James Conant, who is then the president of Harvard. And James Conant is a very important person in the history of education and science, because he introduced, I think, a brilliant method of education at Harvard, which I think they unfortunately, had for a few years and then abandoned. But it certainly shaped me and all of us who've read this book. And the book was born out of the fact that Conant worked with Kuhn to develop a way of teaching science to people who weren't going to go on to become professional scientists. So as the president of Harvard, Conant was thinking, what really should a person learn? Everyone isn't going to become a nuclear physicist, even if they had the capabilities. They don't all have this interest. And yet we think knowing something about science is part of being a broadly educated person. So the question, what does it mean to be informed about science if you're not a professional specialist in the natural sciences, was an animating question for James Conant, the president of Harvard in the 1950s, when Kuhn was teaching there, if I remember my dates right. And Kuhn worked with him to develop these courses. That's where one of his earlier books, an excellent book called The Copernican Revolution, obviously about the Copernican Revolution, that's where that book came out of. And that book helped pave the way for Kuhn coming to structure. So the question of science and Kuhn's obsession with science, a passionate interest in understanding science and how it works, was then fed by the particular kind of serendipitous context at Harvard University at the time because of President Conant. And it led to this extraordinary teaching experience. So this book is a very special book because, unlike most academic books, it comes from a very conscious pedagogical project, and it comes from years in the classroom. And Kuhn acknowledges that and thanks all of his students and colleagues for the clarity that he was able to achieve in the book. And this book is a book of extraordinarily notable clarity. The clarity, in fact, is part of its difficulty. It's so clear, it's hard sometimes to recognize how profound the concepts are. and in some ways how challenging they are, because Kuhn is really very clear about laying them out. So it's a great gift, and that clarity, he himself acknowledges, comes from having taught the subject and presented it in many different ways. So it's a product of teaching, and it's a product of collaboration with Conant and with many other people. And ultimately, it's an attempt to answer the question, what is the nature of science? But it's an attempt to answer it by a person who's realized the following radical fact. If you look at the history of science, then you come to an image of science that's very different than the image of science that you're given as a scientist. So in other words, Kuhn noticed, because he was a professionally trained scientist, which in the American world means only a natural scientist, not just like a scholar, which is the broader European sense of the term scientist, or Wissenschaftler, for example, in German, an academic, basically a scholar, a learned person. A scientist in the technical sense of the word, a person who knows. Kuhn saw, because of his professional training, that the history of science was very, almost disturbingly different than how he thought about science as a physicist in his case. As a trained physicist, he had a certain image of what physics was. He had a certain image of what science was. And this image of science that he had, he realized did not match the history. So when we ask at a deeper level, what is the significance of this book? I've mentioned now sort of two different layers of significance. The first layer is this book is simply one of the most important books in the history of the academy in the 20th century, and it's the single most important book in the field of the history and philosophy of science, which you can separate as fields, but if you separate them, I think that's a big mistake, something I'll talk about in the course of this series. So Kuhn didn't separate them. Kuhn is a philosopher of science, but it's important to recognize he's by practice, he does his philosophy as a person focusing on the history of science, which I think is very important. Methodological insight of his work as a thinker is the importance of history. And this importance of history then is at a deeper layer of connection why this book is so extraordinary. It emerges from a practicing distinguished scientist, with an elite education at the most elite school, he could be at in a sense in America. And he realizes that science isn't what he thought science was. And so this led Kuhn on a quest to understand, well, what is science really like? And the quest led to essentially a new image based on all of his research that was not just original to him, but to the whole field of the history of science. So this is the first sentence of the book's introduction. History, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed. Now, I've put that up on the screen so you can see it, but let me just read it again, so I'll leave it up there. History, if viewed as a repository for more than anecdote or chronology, could produce a decisive transformation in the image of science by which we are now possessed. This is the most clear and simple statement of the significance of the structure of scientific revolutions. Kuhn believes that if we understood the history of science, the way we understand science would change. And he saw himself as part of, as we'll see, an early phase of a transition that would create a shift in human consciousness about the most important subject matter that humans regard as an authority in the contemporary modern world, which is science. So this is a revolutionarily significant claim. I wrote a short review essay that deals with this claim called Science versus Religion and Other Modern Myths some years ago, I think almost a decade ago now, but I've linked that in this lecture. You can read it, and I've also linked, and I'll keep links to these pieces. I've linked a much longer scholarly article that I wrote more recently that's essentially the underlying background to this popular review essay that I wrote, reviewing two books. One, a popular book by evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, and the other, a very scholarly historical work in the history of science by Peter Harrison. And the issue about the role of history in science is the central issue in the structure of scientific revolutions. And I'm going to argue in the course of this series, it's really the underlying motive leads to, I think, people claiming somehow that this book is erroneous or wrong in some core way, which is a very strange claim, as we'll see, because the book is very largely an act of description, which Kuhn recognizes has implications that people could call normative or how we ought to do things. But the book is an attempt to say something theoretically insightful about how science actually works. And many people treat the book like it's just a philosopher speculating, and that's not true. This is a expert historian of the exact sciences and the sciences more broadly, looking at the entire field of the history of science and arguing that the field of the history of science changes the image of science that we have. And therefore, at the heart of our image of science is a contradiction. The contradiction exists between the people who are trained in the sciences and the way that we write, journalists and others, popularly about the sciences, and the actual best attempt of scholars to understand what science is, not at the current moment of time that we happen to be practicing science, but science as an actual historical project. Why did science come into being? Why did the scientific revolution happen? What was the scientific revolution? And what was the significance of it? How did it change the way humans think? These are the questions that historians of science have been interested in. And ultimately, the turn towards history and its integration in science is a revolution in the American Academy. It's a revolution in the American Academy because, you see, there had been for over 100 years in the German academic tradition, which in the 19th century, the Germans kind of, in a sense, invented modern academia and the modern university system. And they made an enormous advance in human progress into knowledge about the world, and particularly knowledge about the natural sciences, the social and historical sciences. And in German, all of those are called sciences. There's historical and social sciences, which in German, the German term is Geisteswissenschaften, which humanities is a very, very rough translation. It's really sort of the sciences of the human mind, or power of understanding and of acting and interpreting, the power of the human spirit, but that doesn't convey the right thing in English. And then Naturwissenschaften, or the sciences of nature. But in German, all of these, of course, are sciences. So Germany had, prior to Thomas Kuhn, for over 100 years, since the German idealists, developed a very complicated but rigorous tradition of thinking about history as a scientific discipline, and also thinking about science in some broad sense as a historically evolving enterprise. However, that tradition of thinking, which I would say culminated in the Neo-Kantian tradition at the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, if you're interested in that, please check out lecture 1 of my series on Martin Heidegger, where I talk about this period of history and the Neo-Kantians. This culminated in the Neo-Kantian period, in which you had an incredibly sophisticated integration of an interest in all of the sciences, the exact sciences, the broader natural sciences like the biological sciences, the social and historical sciences, or the Geisteswissenschaften. And it was a really comprehensive attempt to try to come to terms with what is the nature of science, what is the logic of science. And in the Neo-Kantian movement, there was a very deep kind of family tension between what's often called Baden or Southwestern Neo-Kantianism, because it's based in Baden, Germany, and the Northern Neo-Kantian school, more associated with Berlin. And the difference between these two schools is, very broadly speaking, a difference in their relationship to history. The Baden or Southwestern school of Neo-Kantianism was more oriented historically towards integrating an account of the sciences with history, with developmental ideas, and asking questions about where did these things come from. We would say genetic questions, questions of the genesis or origin and development of things. But all of the Neo-Kantians, particularly the other school, which wasn't as interested in history, but was focused primarily on the sciences, and particularly the natural sciences, this school, associated with people, for example, like Nautorp, Hermann Cohen, some of the famous Neo-Kantians, and then the Baden school, some of the famous names. Heidegger ultimately comes out of this school, but his teacher was Emil Lask, and I think earlier Rickert. So these are some of the names that were part of this movement, but this is over 100 years ago in history. And I want to point this out. This book is from 1962. This German stuff I'm talking about is over 100 years ago. And in this German movement, which had developed a century-long tradition, in a sense, of attempting to engage how do the sciences relate to each other, how do they relate to history, it was beginning to split over the nature of history as a science and the nature of historical science and the nature of science itself. And this split was frankly catastrophic for German culture and for European culture more broadly. It's been famously sort of seen to be embodied in a kind of paradoxical way, a kind of living metaphor in the encounter of Ernst Cassirer, one of the great Neo-Kantians, and Martin Heidegger at Davos in Switzerland in 1927. And there's some great books about this. There's a really good, very kind of scholarly book by a philosopher, and then there's another really good, more kind of gripping narrative book by an excellent intellectual historian at Harvard, Peter Eli Gordon. So if you're interested in that, you can check out those works. But this period essentially saw the rupture of science and history in the German world. And in a sense, those who opted for history, like Heidegger, apparently, if you know my work on Heidegger, I don't think Heidegger is particularly historical in one sense, but he's very oriented towards the concept of history, and using the concept of the past is a very important role in his philosophy. And then those oriented towards validity, which had unified all of the Neo-Kantians, is how are things scientifically valid? What is real knowledge? How do we know when we have real knowledge? How do humans acquire it? All of these questions. So essentially from the 19th century onward in the German world, there was a very concerted, of course it was vociferous and had different dividing elements, but it was a very concerted effort by many different antagonistically oriented thinkers to try to understand science and history, not as separate things, but as things that were somehow connected to each other, because history was a type of science, of course, and that had questions. And then history was a science that you also could use to understand everything, in a sense. Everything has a history that we see in this world in some sense. And so the history of things like mathematics and physics and biology began to have the potential for a type of systematic understanding in the German-speaking world, again, over 100 years ago. But as Friedrich Beiser, the great scholar of German philosophy, says, Neo-Kantianism died in the trenches of World War I. So basically after 1914, there had been a kind of prepared and brewing movement that then was cataclysmically unleashed by the destruction of the Great War, World War I, we now say, which led to the death of a lot of the more rationalistic-oriented forms of German philosophy and forms of science. And it led to a split where a form of scientifically oriented philosophy emerged called logical positivism that had already existed, but it became much more politically and culturally significant, in a sense, after World War I. And then the influence of Martin Heidegger emerged as one of the great influences on 20th century German philosophy, and Heidegger is very broadly oriented towards a very historical, and Heideggerians would argue not anti-scientific, but if you're a scientist or if you're a person who really respects the natural sciences, Heidegger can look very anti-scientific. And I think in a complicated way, Heidegger is critical of the sciences in the broadest sense, which is, I think, a very big problem with his work, but it's also connected to his work's influence. Is there was already in the beginning of the 20th century a very great concern in the German world about what science is and whether it's actually good for humans. And you see an enormous pessimism emerging that is most famously distilled first in Max Weber's lecture, Science as a Vocation, Wissenschaft als Beruf in German, in which Weber, in a very powerful lecture, lays out a very nihilistic ideal of scientific knowledge. And in that ideal of scientific knowledge, he says that the most that any one scholar can hope to contribute is a tiny drop in the ocean that will be forgotten, because science has already grown so vast and it just keeps accumulating. And so Kuhn had an image of science that he thought was valid, that it was scientific, that science itself was giving us knowledge, but it didn't give us, he thought, values. It didn't tell us how we ought to behave. science itself was the product of a set of values. And so the nature of science and the way it's connected to history and to values was a major issue in the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the German-speaking world, where this conversation had developed, again, over a century. And it never really came to America. So this really deep division between the German world and the English-speaking world, not just America, but also England, England is a very complicated relationship to the historical sciences. In some ways, England is like one of the greatest, well, not just England as a country, but Great Britain, and has produced so many of the greatest historians. I mean, of course, Gibbon, the Scottish get a lot of people in this. Hume was a great historian. And the English historical tradition is a marvelous tradition. But there's a deep tension between the English tradition of scholarship and history and the German tradition. Very deep tension that has to do with cultural differences between Germany and England and the English-speaking world. And it has to do with tensions also, in a sense, in the scholarly sensibility that emerged through Oxford and Cambridge, and then the scholarly sensibility that emerged in the scientific university in Germany, the research university of the 19th century. And these were really out of sync with each other. And they each have strengths and weaknesses, but there's a complicated history of this sort of accommodation or conflict and productive tension between all of the brilliant people working in England and Germany, of course, in France and other places. But the point is, the English-speaking world broadly did not receive these debates and did not understand their significance. And then with the war, and then the horrors of the interwar period, the Great Depression, and then, of course, the horrors of the Second World War, the Holocaust, all of these terrors, the conversation was essentially entirely forgotten and shelved. And Kuhn does not come at his work by reference to this conversation. Kuhn was very learned, so I'm not saying he would have been unaware of it, but rather Kuhn is working as a technical, very exacting, rigorous historian of science, and he's most influenced by the great French historian of science, Alexandre Koyré, who is a marvelous figure who I'll talk about at different points in this series, but he's also extremely influential on my own work, and I discovered him originally through Kuhn's book. So Kuhn is reflecting a scholarly tradition from the German, French, and English-speaking world of the history of the sciences. He is not interacting with this now long dead German tradition in a sort of conscious sense, even though the German tradition is actually very important, as we'll see. Kuhn cites a German book on facts as a crucial book in this that was written in the 1930s, and I'll talk a bit about that in the course of the series. But this reality is all the more remarkable because what it means is, independently entirely of a tradition that had begun thinking about these things, and in fact, in a sense, came to a conflict point and was destroyed in its internal unity over the division between science and history, and what a scientific history says about science, and how scientific validity and truth relates to historical study. This tradition that emerged in Germany was completely obliterated, in a sense, from the consciousness of most people who had known about it. And it was never present, as I've said, consciously in the same way in the English-speaking world. Because even where people did read German, many of them weren't reading these books in German, even if they could. And then many of the books weren't translated because, again, more people could read German then, so there was less translation. But that also means if you didn't read the book in German, you would never see it. So many of the important books in the world I'm talking about, the Neo-Kantians, were some of them were translated, but many of them were not. And so that's part of the linguistic divide, but it's a deeper divide, as I've said, than that. It's cultural and intellectual sensibilities also that are diverging in this conflict. And what Kuhn's book represents is the reemergence of this problematic in a completely original, profoundly insightful American key. And it's very significant that it's emerging, I think, at the time it does in 1962, because of the status of America. America, after World War II, became the center of the natural sciences. And this represents a massive shift from the prior history in which Germany was the leader in the natural sciences, and particularly the exact sciences, where Germany, France, England, of course, and America, they all produce great scholars, great physicists, great scientists in many fields. But, Germany was a clear leader. You can think about that just thinking about the names of scientists who are famous in the 20th century and the 19th century. There's an enormous representation of Germans. And after World War II, for many obvious reasons, one of which is most of the German scientific talent got siphoned off into Russia and through Operation Paperclip into America. But then the other difference, of course, being Germany and German culture was obviously desecrated in the eyes of many people, including the Germans. And so the pride in Germany was destroyed, and the European Germanic tradition of scholarship was essentially not replaced in fact, but replaced in prestige by the Anglophone tradition, the democratic scholarly tradition of, England and America. And then the success of the Manhattan Project meant that America had developed the most successful scientific wartime project that changed the course of history. And so that meant in order to do that project, we of course recruited all of these scientists, famously, people like Enrico Fermi and others, the greatest nuclear physicists in the world, in order to work on the project. So coming out of World War II, basically in 1945, right, the context in which Kuhn is a young man, coming out of World War II, you see that America now is in a completely new position in world history. America is now the scientific leader of the world. It's now the imperial leader of the world. It's now the wealthiest country in the world. And apart from Russia, it's the only really great military power in the world. And so the context of Kuhn's time, 1962, broadly speaking, of course, during the Cold War, is there's Russian science, of course, there's European science, but really American science is the big game in town. And America has become very prestigious with, for example, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, which has now, by this point, of course, people like Einstein, Gödel, so many famous people who had done, groundbreaking work earlier in the century or in the mid-century. And they're in America, and particularly the Jewish emigres from Germany and from Europe fleeing the Holocaust, they contribute enormously to the scientific culture, prestige, and insight of the American academic community. And so the fact that the problem of history and the way history changes and threatens to create a new image of science, the idea that a scientific image of science itself emerging from history will lead to a revolution, is what animates Kuhn's book. So he says that we are possessed by an image of science that will be decisively transformed. It could be if history is viewed as a repository for more than anecdote, which is to say not theoretically significant, but just examples of things, or chronology, which is just to say we got from here to here to here to here, but ultimately nothing's really different. So in other words, if you take history seriously as something that can be different than the present, then if you look at science from the standpoint of its development, you come to a radically different image of science. So in no way is Kuhn attacking science. Kuhn loves science. He devoted his entire life to science. What Kuhn is doing is he's registering a scholarly reality, which is that after decades of studying the history of science, Kuhn realizes that the entire field of the history of science has global implications that would transform how all humans think about science, including practicing natural scientists. Now, this was written again in 1962, so we have all of the intervening decades since. Obviously, at this point, it's 60 plus years. And the question is, what is the status of this decisive transformation that could have happened? And the reason I'm talking about Kuhn today, and the reason I'm doing this course in public for free, even though I could have, taught it for the people who buy my courses, is because I'm very concerned about this. This issue is at the center of my life. I'm the director of the Meanings of Science Project with support from the Templeton World Charity Foundation at the Marginalia Review of Books, where I have the privilege, working with my co-director, Peter Harrison, to get to know and interview and work with and commission essays from and publish these essays from many of the world's leading scholars on the history of science and the nature of science, from physicists and biologists, again, to historians and others. And if you look, this issue is the central issue, in a sense, that's concerning contemporary science today, is all the concerns about diversity and inclusion are ultimately concerns about why the image of science we have excludes those people. So Lindy Elkins-Tanton, for example, who's a contributor to our project, she's the director of NASA's mission to Psyche. And she has an amazing conversation with Philip Ball, who's a extraordinarily profound and prolific authority on science and popular writer on science. He's also for 20 years was an editor at the scientific journal Nature. Philip Ball talks to Lindy Elkins-Tanton about her project for NASA and her work, and you can watch that on the Marginally Review of Books channel. I've linked it below. And if you watch that conversation, you will see that Lindy explicitly mentions a sort of tension between a certain German idea of science, which she's sort of talking about in its cultural manifestations, its gendered manifestations, and the different culture of science that she, for example, is self-consciously advocating for in her work as a very distinguished scientist who is managing an $800 million, at this point, 11-year-long, it'll eventually be 20-year-long NASA mission. So these are the people that I have the joy of having conversations with and learning from, the practicing scientists and the natural sciences. And then I make my own minor contributions, right, as a historian and philosopher, but I also get to talk to these people. And I'm doing this project because I think that the way we think about science is one of, if not the most important things we can possibly think about. And if we don't think about science in a way that's faithful to the reality of science, then we'll be doing disservice to ourselves and to science. And so ultimately, the reason that I think we should all be concerned with the structure of scientific revolutions, the reason I think we should all be interested in this book, and the reason that I hope you'll continue, subscribe to this channel and continue to watch this series and to share it with your friends, maybe watch it with them, is because I think there's few things more important than science. I'm a great lover of science in all of its forms. I'm not an expert in the natural sciences, but I am an expert in the philosophical and historical sciences that I work in. That would be the way a European would speak. We say a scholar in the American Anglophone context. And I'm particularly interested in the issue of how you integrate knowledge. That's what I do at the Marginally Review of Books. It's what I do in the Becoming Human project and in all of my work, is I'm interested in how do you respect the rigorous exactitude of specialist scholarship, but recognize it has to be integrated into a broader picture. And a broader picture of what science really is requires you use history. You have to have historical data. Well, how have we done things? Why have things emerged the way they have? And what's at stake, therefore, in science isn't just something so important to us, it's also our image of the world that science gives us. The scientific image of the world is also our image of science. So the scientific image of the world is inseparable from how we understand science. So therefore, the issue of what is science, why does science develop the way it does, how does it develop, how is there a change in science, ultimately touches on the deepest questions that humans are concerned with. What is knowledge? How do we know things are true? How do we understand the development of different knowledge claims and the fact that people disagree and compete with each other? So we'll see that these are the central questions, the questions of the actual nature and validity and development of science, that Kuhn is taking for granted the validity of science, but he's recognizing and trying to understand, well, what would an image of science be if we could really get the best ideas we have, everything we know about science, and put it all together? How would we view science? And the answer is the structure of scientific revolutions and the subsequent 60 years of its reception. So please join me in lecture 2 as I'll dive into directly the beginning of the book, and I'll give you a kind of outline of it, and then I'll give you an exposition. So thank you very much for joining me. My name again is Samuel Loncar. I'm the founder and creator of the Becoming Human project, the editor of the Marginally Review of Books, and I'm a historian of philosophy broadly, but particularly the relationship between philosophy, religion, and science. And I thank you very much for joining me. I'd ask you to like the video if you've enjoyed it, and please do subscribe and join me again.